Good evening, welcome to St. Jerome's University and welcome to the St. Jerome's Center for Catholic Experience. My name is Scott Klein and I am the director of the center. I want to thank you for coming this evening. We've had the unfortunate sort of scenario this year at the center where we've, every Friday night where we've had a center event, we've been met with some sort of mini disaster. Lights going out, bad weather. We had Dean Coates here during a snowstorm. He was talking on the Arctic, so it fit right in, so people were very hardy and well-dressed for that one. Tonight we were looking at the weather and thinking, oh my goodness, it's going to snow and ice and all those kinds of things. So that's held off, and you've come out on this very blustery winter January evening, which is part of the New Year, and welcome to New Year in Canada. We should be used to this. I'll be shutting this down in just a second, but before I do so, I want to set up this evening's lecture and also some of the direction that we're going to be heading in this new year. As you know, we're marking the 25th anniversary of the center this year. When this endeavor started back in 1982 with Michael Higgins as its director, it was intended as a place for people in the Kitchener-Waterloo area to come together to talk about issues that matter, issues like social justice, Christian spirituality in the modern age, issues such as healthcare, the environment, and what it means to be Canadian. This year, in the middle of our lecture series, we actually had 3 lectures devoted to Canada, our home and native land, or at least for some of you. I'm actually an American still, so we're not trying to invade, I don't think. But anyway, your home and native land, I guess. I'm trying to become a Canadian. In any case, we had 3 lectures devoted to that topic. The first one was by Michael Adams, the author of The Unlikely Utopia. And if you had a chance to read the Globe and Mail last week, he had an op-ed in there about the unlikely utopia, namely Canada. We then had Ken Coates late last November talking about the Arctic and some of the success stories that you don't often hear about in mainstream media. And that was our CBC lecture. So tonight is the final lecture on Canada in this little sort of small lecture series within the larger lecture series. It will be performed, given by, presented by Dr. Myroslaw Tataryn, our Dean and Vice President at St. Jerome's University. So, what is tonight's lecture about? Who's sponsoring? This is our 2007-2008 Waterloo Catholic District School Board lecture. They provide tremendous amount of funding for this lecture series. I have background music going on. Can you hear this? If you can't hear it, it's great. I'm going to start dancing. It's a Ukrainian dance or something, I think, is going on in the background. The Christmas trees are for Myroslav, by the way, I think. They're still here. He just celebrated Christmas a couple of days ago. Tonight's lecture is the 2007-2008 Waterloo Catholic District School Board. St. Jerome's University has a very strong relationship with the school board, and we very much appreciate the continuation of that relationship and how much support the district gives to us. So about tonight's lecture and tonight's lecturer. As I said, it's Dr. Myroslaw Tataryn. Dr. Tataryn is Dean and Vice President of St. Jerome's University. He is a priest in the Ukrainian Catholic Church, which is in union with the Roman Catholic Church. He is the husband of Maria and father to 3 beautiful daughters. I think a few of them are here tonight. I'm sure he'll be happy to introduce them to you. He has authored or co-authored several books, including Christianity and the New Ukraine, published in 2002, Windows to the East, published in 2001, Augustine and Russian Orthodoxy in 2000, and Praying with Icons in 1998. By the way, Chuck Arian, with Wordsworth Books, has graciously, actually he forced them upon me, given me a couple of those books to inform you that he's selling those in the back. I have the How to Pray Icons up here and Windows to the East. That's a heavy book. Very heavy, but also beautiful inside, I suppose, with icons. Before coming to St. Jerome's, Dr. Tataryn was chair of the Department of Religious Studies at St. Thomas More College, and before that, executive director of the St. Sophia Religious Association of Ukrainian Catholics in Canada. This lecture is based on work that will be appearing in a forthcoming volume, edited by St. Jerome's David Seljak, whom many of you know, which examines the varieties of Christianity in Canada. As we welcome Myroslav to the podium, I will shut down the computer, and now is when we clap for Myroslav. Welcome, Myroslav.
Thank you very much, Scott. And it really is an honor being here, being part of the lecture series that we hold. And I think it's probably, it's my 3rd year here, and I guess Scott figured it's either safe to have me Or what I think is the real reason is, you invite the dean when you want a cheap lecturer, right? Low cost. And it's hard for me then to say no because I'm the one on his back all the time about budgets, right? If you're not satisfied with the lecture, that's why the envelopes are there. The budget problem can be dealt with that way. I should say in terms of the relationship between what you're going to hear today and the upcoming volume that David and Paul Bramadat from University of Winnipeg are putting together, and that's a second volume of a 3-volume series on religion and ethnicity in Canada. The lecture today is really based on, only the first part of the lecture is really what went into that book, so that you're not disappointed if you're buying the book because you think you want to hear more of what I'm talking about today. It's only Ukrainian Catholic, or the Ukrainian and Eastern churches that I talk about in the book. But it's true that the story of Eastern Christianity is much of what's informed my perspective on the topic at hand. A number of years ago, while I was still teaching in Saskatoon, I was researching late 19th and early 20th century Canadian religious politics on the prairies, and 9/11 happened. At the time, I didn't really see clearly any connection between the event which we've come to see as having changed global perspectives and my interesting, but admittedly limited research. That research resulted in part, at least, in a senior seminar, which I entitled God Keep Our Land, the title I've used for today's presentation. It was in preparation for the seminar, and then thanks to the very vigorous and insightful reflections of the participants, that I came to realize that the interrelationship of religion, Canadian identity, immigration, and multiculturalism is inadequately examined in our Canadian social and political discourse, and yet deeply impacts what I see as a very unhealthy response to religiously distinct communities in Canada, especially post 9/11, the Muslim community. Evidence of the problematizing of religion and especially Canadian identity abound. The late 1980s debate over Sikhs wearing turbans as part of the RCMP uniform. The recent legal case in Quebec over Gurbaj Singh Multani's right to wear a kirpan to school. The flap over Asmahan Mansour's wearing the hijab while playing soccer. The province-wide commission into reasonable accommodation in Quebec. And finally, the total reticence just recently to engage in a discussion during the provincial election here in Ontario about faith-based schooling. And this latter is particularly significant for us, given, as Scott informed us, that today's lecture is sponsored by a faith-based school board, the Waterloo Roman Catholic School Board. And this lecture series is conducted at St. Jerome's University, a Catholic institution, which receives public funding. What is the role of religion in Canadian identity? Or perhaps, more accurately, where does religion belong in the Canada of today? This is the underlying question of this evening's lecture, and I intend to approach it with a dash of history, a sprinkle of myth-busting, and a dose of personal reflection. I don't propose to have a definitive answer or answers, but I do hope to convince you that the question is burning and demands attention, discussion, and concern. Finally, I will propose that the question is not one about religion as such, or about anyone's particular religious practices. Rather, it is about the type of secular society we wish to live in. Secularism is in fact a product of what Charles Taylor has called the Christianity of the North Atlantic world. It has helped establish a civil realm wherein people rooted in similar cultural backgrounds navigate differences, especially religious ones, which in previous generations led inextricably to conflict and war. This product of Western Christianity has given us a profoundly valuable notion of human rights. Yet, what we sometimes fail to realize is that secularism has colors and hues. Secular societies are not all the same, and given our demography, we Canadians must not fear to forge a secular society which respects cultural differences and even embraces them. Further, perhaps one of Canada's unique contributions to the many colors of secularism is that we can admit that religion can be one of the most important aspects of a person's and community's cultural identity. And so we can develop a secular society which recognizes an appropriate place for the many manifestations of human religiosity and religious discourse. As I turn our attention to some of the history involved in the question of religion's place in the development of our national identity, I will engage, as I said, in a bit of myth-busting. So as a prelude, I recall the explanation provided by Daniel Francis of myths and their function. Quote, "Myths are not lies. They express important truths. They usually do not provide a precise record of events, but that is because they serve other purposes. Myths idealize. They select particular events and institutions which seem to embody important cultural values and elevate them to the status of legend. Myths are echoes of the past, resonating in the present. Memory implies its opposite, forgetfulness. As a community, we forget as much as we remember. And what we choose to forget tells as much about us as what we choose to remember. End quote. Therefore, my myth-busting is not an act of demolition, but rather of recovery. Recovery for the purpose of understanding ourselves as Canadians better. I arrived in Canada as a 7-year-old from England, and I well remember feeling very empowered in coming to a country which celebrated its openness to new cultures, its embrace of especially Slavic immigrants, and the specific mention of Ukrainians and their contribution to the opening up of the taming of the Canadian prairie. The myth made me proud. I think for many of us, this myth is a source of great pride. Canada welcomes everyone, and we have made a place for everyone. Now, once we put our critical hats on, we know that the statement needs to be tempered by many less well-advertised facts, not the least of which is how the dominant European element has marginalized and essentially eliminated the First Nations peoples from the constructed national mythology. But as I said at the outset, this area of interest started with my research into religious politics on the prairies, and there's enough stuff there in need of recovery to keep our attention. The opening of the Canadian West to European immigrants was not an act of political or social generosity. It was fundamentally an economic decision made with a great purpose in mind. Well argued by many today, Canada's opening of the West involved two less than noble goals: effectively eliminating the strength of the First Nations peoples, and secondly, improving upon the late 19th century British imperial ideal by building a purer British civilization. Daniel Coleman writes, "For early ideologues of the emerging Canadian nation, the country's northern location meant that it would remain the domain of upwardly mobile white people, and its Nordic environment would so strengthen and sharpen them that they would be improved over their British ancestral stock." End quote. The literature of the time is littered with references to a clash of civilizations, which occurred when this British ideal was met with the reality of the new immigrants. And of course, the ostensibly superior British culture rose to the challenge. Again, Coleman. One reason why Canadian society can claim exemplary progressive status during and after Clifford Sifton's aggressive campaign to recruit Eastern European farmers for the newly annexed prairies is because of the British Canadians' capacity to accommodate and civilize what they considered to be foreigners. However, there were clear criteria for governing this process of assimilation, and it related to the moral character. But moral character sifted through a very specific racial hierarchy and religious framework. Even a figure such as J.S. Wordsworth, who, because of his later views, would be called the conscience of the nation by some, recognized the value of immigrants and recognized the value of immigrants in the development of Canada. In 1909, elucidated a taxonomy of preferred peoples. Preferred because of their putative disposition to assuming the moral norms of civility necessary for building the new Canadian nation. This pecking order found immigrants from the British Isles most desirable, preferably, by the way, Protestants. Then Scandinavians, Germans, French, Southeastern Europeans, Austro-Hungarians, and Jews, and at the very bottom, sorry Gabe, Italians. Another such listing from 1938 does not differ greatly. It is found in John Murray Gibbons' Canadian Mosaic, The Making of a Northern Nation, again quoting Coleman. Gibbons' list proceeds down the hierarchy of racial national origins from France and Britain at the top to Northwestern Europe in the middle, and finally to Eastern European and Jews at the bottom. Unlike Wordsworth, however, Gibbon excludes blacks, Chinese, and other Asians completely. The extent to which these scholarly views reflected general perspectives can be seen in the writing of prominent church leaders. We can easily recognize the palpable relief expressed by the Presbytery of High River, Alberta, when it reports to the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in 1908 that, in their community, quote, there are practically none of the inferior grades of European immigrants, that is, Galicians, end quote. Or the judgment upon Ukrainians made in 1912 report of the Presbyterian Home Mission Service. The Ukrainians, quote, have not reached our stage of culture, and what we would look upon as obscene, they take to be quite right, end quote. In referring to Ukrainians in his home riding of Edmonton, the local MP in 1899 offered the following, quote, they were not fit for free institutions of this country, and the time will come when they will hold the balance of political power here unless a damper is put on them very soon. And when they become our legislators, God help us. The specter of the immigrant is not a post-9/11 phenomenon. But these anxieties and images of impending doom were rooted in a Christian culture and milieu. So the answer, of course, was sought in religion. God, keep our land. And so it was. The banner displayed over the central stage of the 1913 National Assembly of the Presbyterian Church of Canada read, "Will they make Christian Canadians?" In 1916, the principal of Saskatoon College, a seminary, Edmund Oliver, declared that the central task of the school was to ensure the Canadianization of the new populace. Dr. A. Patterson, a medical doctor and an immigration chaplain, wrote that the church had to facilitate overthrowing the evils of these new people in order to have a united country and, quote, a Canada for Christ. In 1922, the Reverend W.G. Smith proclaimed, quote, "Nation building and Christian progress go hand in hand in this fair dominion. The reciprocal relationships are astonishing. The nation is built as Christianity grows, and Christianity grows as the nation is built." End quote. Once more, a voice from the Presbyterian Home Mission experience. James Robertson writing in 1889 that church and state must work together to Christianize this heterogeneous mass. Even if this goal may sound admirable to contemporary pious Christian ears, remember that the objects of this Christianization were Catholic and Orthodox Ukrainians, Catholic Poles, Catholic Germans, Doukhobors, Hutterites, Mennonites, on the prairies, French Canadians, and the list goes on. In other words, it is not religious evangelization we are talking about here, but rather an underlying imperialist perspective which valorizes English Protestant traditions over all others. Effectively, Canada in the pre-World War I period welcomed the strangers into the gates and then wanted to build a new Jerusalem rooted in a British liberal Protestant worldview. Coleman gives some texture to this worldview. He writes, "Britishness as a form of government as a union of formerly hostile peoples." And by Britishness, Coleman refers to Scots, English, Welsh, and Protestant Irish. As a civilization, demonstrated that former enemies could set aside their differences and in a spirit of disinterested objectivity work cooperatively together in a common enterprise. They could create an orderly society, even a race, which provided its members with freedom of conscience and access to economic opportunity, regardless of differences of caste and creed, but only for those people. Because Britishness, for these English Canadians, represented the most advanced form of political and social life in the world. It was therefore assumed as the civil norm to which non-British Canadians should assimilate. That British Canadianness was therefore presented as the evolutionary product of a rationally sound development. In the face of French Canadian Catholicism, English Canada would argue that their perspective was not a religious one, but rather an objectively grounded assessment of the best possible society. Although initially rooted in late 19th and early 20th century British Protestantism, this view of Canada gradually had more to do with validating the newfound power in Canada of white Anglo-Celtic Protestants than with promoting a Christian country. The language of peace, order, and good government masks origins within a specific Christian worldview. What comes to be viewed as the beginning of a secular society in Canada was not the product of the rejection of religion. It was rather the elevation of a particular Christian tradition over all others, and one which privileged individualism because of its roots in that Christian tradition. However, given the French-Canadian presence and that after the Great War accommodations were being made to some of the ethnic and Christian diversity on the prairies, this WASP model was amended and transfigured. In so doing, the overt association of Christianity with the Canadian nation dimmed and went underground. It was supplanted by the language of an increasingly multicultural society, adjusting to increasing numbers of immigrants and of a commitment to openness and civility, in contrast to the stereotypical assessment of America as racist and a melting pot. Coleman, however, suggests, quote, "Canada's inclusive civility, imagined here as a multicolored mosaic, actually insists that all its tiles will be various shades of white," end quote. This is a judgment increasingly highlighted by voices of people belonging to visible minorities. Camille Hernandez-Ramdoir, for example, a woman of color born in Winnipeg in 1965, writes, "My general feeling has been that I do not feel like a Canadian despite being born and raised here, because I am not accepted as one at face value. People, upon meeting me, still open conversations with, 'And where are you from?' as if a person of my complexion could not possibly be born here. On a personal note, when I'm asked my name and I say Myroslav, I often get the same question. Where were you born? And so I delight in telling people, Manchester, England. Makes lots of sense. We have believed that Canada was the generous, inviting country that welcomed immigrants with open arms 100 years ago. And that's only a partial truth. The community which welcomed those immigrants had a very precise and not too welcoming agenda. Those immigrants were to be civilized, cleansed of their deviant religiosity, or in the language of the day, superstitions, and brought to enlightenment. An enlightenment not reflective of a broadly understood Christian worldview, but a very specific, historically conditioned British liberal Protestant perspective. Contemporary claims referring to Canada as a Christian nation thus need to be problematized. That Christian character was neither inclusive nor intended to respect other Christian traditions. Canada, as a Christian nation of old, only reluctantly made room for the types of other Christians I presume are the majority in this room. Apparent openness masked an undercurrent of intolerance. It was out of this particular Christian perspective that Canada's public education system was born. It married the goals of civilizing and assimilating. Quote, "The great work of the public school in Canada is the foundation and development of a high type of national life. This is particularly true in Western Canada, with its heterogeneous population. These incongruous elements have to be assimilated, have to be welded into one harmonious whole if Canada is to attain the position that we, who belong here by right of birth and blood, claim for her. The chief instrument in this process of assimilation is the public school." T.M. Maguire, Superintendent of Education, Manitoba, 1909. In writing about this period, Myroslaw Tataryn remarks that, quote, "public schools were designated the guardians of Anglo-Celtic culture, linguistic homogeneity, and national unity," end quote. However, the realities of cultural pluralism mitigated the possibility that this dominant perspective would become absolutely overwhelming throughout Canada. Although the rhetoric of that perspective remains in our public discourse, we have, practically speaking, walked a slightly different road. Over the past 100 years, whether by plan or default, we have shifted away from the original neo-British worldview. Canada has allowed the existence of a pseudo-autonomous system of schooling for Hutterites on the prairies, fully funded faith-based and charter public school boards in Alberta, many fully funded Catholic school boards across the country, and an array of mechanisms for faith-based schools to receive partial funding. Admittedly, though, built around the assumption of Canada's Christian European character. In building the Canada of today, we have implicitly recognized that religion is an undeniable facet of cultural and national identity. And so, just as our immigration history has precluded and enforced cultural homogeneity, we have had to accept a Christian pluralism which the nation builders of over 100 years ago would have decried as antithetical to the health of the Dominion. However, it reflects a role for religion kept noticeably muted in the public forum. Yet if my suggestion of a limited Christian pluralism is true, why the consternation over the issues I remarked upon at the outset? First, an offering from John Moore in the National Post from February of last year. Quote, "Like most dust-ups over integration, 11-year-old Azi Manzour's hijab is not the issue. Her otherness is. Visual signs of otherness have always been a threat to North Americans. With each successive wave of immigration to our shores, there have been complaints about the failure of one group or another to abandon their customs, language, and traditional clothing. From the Chinese who labored on the railways through the Russians, Italians, Ukrainians, South Americans, Vietnamese, and now Arabs and South Asians, there's been a malaise in the established community that we're verging on the tipping point of fundamentally changing what it is to be North American." Moore's point is undeniable. Race is a factor. Race is a factor in the observations I cited of Camille Hernandez-Ramdoir. On this point, I would cite the words of Dududien, the Special Rapporteur of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, who in his 2004 report suggested that we in Canada, quote, "cannot begin to combat everyday racism until we unearth, rather than suppress, the history of white supremacy and colonial racism that are fundamental to the establishment of Canada as a nation," end quote. Racism is a demon we need to face in our history and in our contemporary reality. However, as a result of our polite Canadian civility, I believe that there is another elephant in the room that we are reluctant to address: religion and covert religious intolerance. I believe that immigration over the past 40 years is forcing us to deal with that elephant in a new way. First of all, let me remind you of the transformation from our immigration statistics. In the period 1961 through 70, 69% of immigrants to Canada came from Europe, whereas between 1991 and 2000, only 19.5% came from Europe. In the area of religion, between 1991 and 2001, the number of Muslims in Canada more than doubled, and the Hindu, Buddhist, and Sikh populations rose by over 80%. This shift means that over the past 30 years, non-European immigrants exceeded immigrants from Europe. Thus, the assumptions of a Western European secular liberal tradition, which greatly values individualism and is rooted in Western Christianity, cannot be presumed to be shared by all the new immigrants. In fact, just because someone is from Europe does not mean that they share this tradition either. This shift in demographics requires of us a rethinking of our notion of secularism. In a very superficial manner, I would proffer that we have a public notion of secularism that isolates religion to the private sphere, making it difficult to discuss religion in public, while implicitly we privilege products of Western Christianity over other expressions of religion. I suggest we witnessed this phenomenon during the recent Ontario provincial election. We didn't want to discuss faith-based education because Catholics feared it would begin a discourse of subtraction, losing the right to Catholic school boards. Or it could have led to a discussion of what we do with the religious attitudes of new immigrants, and so reveal a latent Islamophobia. Although we do not have a rigid separation of church and state as codified in the United States, in Canada at least, in the public realm, we have effectively banned discussion of religion. We have lost the language for safe public discourse around religion and religious questions. Ironically, although the United States purports to maintain this rigid separation, religion has a presence in the public arena. God bless America. However, in Canada, we now have a populace, as a result of our shifting demographic, that is eager to engage in religious questions publicly, and that rejects the popular North Atlantic privatization of religion. Just as the other Christians challenged the early Canadian notion of building a Christian that is British Protestant Canada, today our new immigrants are challenging the way in which we have segregated religion from the public sphere. We are challenged to analyze more closely our notion of what it means to describe Canada as a secular society. Although we eagerly invite new immigrants to Canada, implicitly we expect them to accept our unexamined notion of secularity, with its embedded emphasis on individualism, and its disjuncture with much of our lived experience. Yet Canada's history implicitly betrays a strategy of accommodating religion, as long as that accommodation does not inflict perceived harm on those around the religious community. And that, for example, was the perceived problem with the Duke of Boers and Sons of Freedom in British Columbia a number of decades ago. A cursory review of legal decisions over the past 2 decades suggests rulings reflecting religious tolerance and the promotion of pluralism. An alternate view that Canadian society should not make room in the public sphere for religion is based on a view of secularism, as I said, born of certain privatizing currents in late 19th century Protestant thought. But this notion of secularism is not about the elimination of religion, although that can be one of its outcomes. Rather, secularism in this case refers to a shift away from a society wherein religion, specifically Christianity, is to have a privileged normative role, to a society where that role is subtly and sometimes imperceptibly negotiated. Religious faith becomes one among many ways in which we as human beings negotiate our identity as persons and as members of a group. It is no longer the defining factor. Whereas secularism, rooted in this 19th century thought, relegates religion to the private, moral sphere, away from political discourse. Religion is often judged as a thing of the past, something which over time is to be surpassed by the exercise of a pure rationality. Charles Taylor, in his recent work, A Secular Age, juxtaposes a different perspective to this approach of subtraction, as he calls it. Taylor views modernity and secularity as a process of addition, quote, the fruit of new innovations, newly constituted self-understandings, and related practices, end quote. This project of cultural self-definition is what we are being called to today. We must find a language by which we can once more make the values of various religious communities accepted participants in our political discourse. To a degree, this is what the Supreme Court of Canada did in accepting the arguments of the Sikh community on the nature of the kirpan and therefore allowing it in the schools. But further, we should not shy away from using our theological insights as sources of attitudes to be nurtured and promoted in the social forum. However, this cannot be done from narrowly sectarian or denominational perspectives, using language which is implicitly exclusionary. Rather, new language needs to be appropriated, which is, for lack of a better term, secular in nature, but which effectively communicates the content of the theological discourse of our own tradition. Take a few moments to recall that although we often think of national or religious identity as fixed or essential notions, they are in fact constructed realities. As such, they can be either constructed unconsciously and implicitly, or intentionally and explicitly. When our public discourse moves into the territory of opposing accommodations for new immigrants or long-standing religious minorities in Canada by appealing to Canadian identity, it does so rather arbitrarily. Canadian identity is being negotiated as we speak, in this case, as I speak. It is not a fixed term out there somewhere, but rather the product of choices and decisions we make relating to our recovery of historical events and perceptions remembered and forgotten as applied to contemporary realities. It is therefore a communal and ongoing process. The nature of our Canadian society as secular is also a negotiated reality. Finally, the extent to which and manner in which those of us who regard ourselves as persons of religion decide to make our religious values sources for positions in the public forum are also negotiated. What our history has shown us is that behind the veil of secularity in Canadian society lies a very specific religious worldview, a worldview which most Canadians today would not want to defend. However, we do recognize, I believe, the need to restrain the normative force of specific religious perspectives on public discourse, meaning no one religious perspective need be privileged over others. Conversely, public discourse cannot effectively engage all voices. It silences religious perspectives, which serve as a source of personal and communal identity. The need for a new language, a new discourse, I believe, is clear. While it would be inappropriate for me to claim the solution to this dilemma of communication, I can offer an approach arising from my community's religious tradition. The theology of the Trinity in the Christian East is not simply an insight into the Godhead. It is also, and very profoundly, a statement about ultimate existence. It affirms the notion that at the core of all reality is community, a radical community rooted in diversity. God is one, God is three. It is also a diversity which escapes rational explanation. In a class I used to teach on the history of Christian thought, we'd always have to deal with this problem. How do you explain the Trinity? So, this is what I would say. There's only one God. That one God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And everything you can say about the Father, you can say about the Son. And everything you say about the Son, you can say about the Holy Spirit. And everything you say about the Holy Spirit, you can say about the Father. Except the Father is the Father, the Son is the Son, and the Holy Spirit is the Holy Spirit. Clear as mud, right? Each is fully God, yet each is fully unique. There is in God absolute unity and absolute diversity. That's the fundamental Christian Trinitarian doctrine. From this fundamental and profoundly Christian paradox, Christians of the East have extrapolated the basic assertion that unity is built in diversity. Unity does not eliminate diversity. Similarly true, being in fullness of being lies in community. These convictions underlay approaches to theological anthropology, ecclesiology, etc. I believe that this theological perspective is valuable for us as a society. Without appeal to the explicit theological tradition, I would argue for the viability of a view of human community which recognizes that diversity is a fundamental given of all nature. The Platonic notion of the ultimate as one is not supported by our experience of the world. Plurality is central to our experience, and no matter how deeply we delve into the micro levels of existence, we are confronted over and over again with plurality, diversity. On the macro level, we have not been able to really conceptualize the single moment of the Big Bang. We talk about it, but what is it? We can't. Although we can rationally conceive of the awe-inspiring diversity of the instant after the Big Bang. Recognizing the givenness of diversity means that we must consciously and deliberately oppose the evident human proclivity to force an erasure of perceived otherness. We validate through repetition the notion that unity must be established through conformity to a presupposed ideal. A unity in diversity is dismissed as an impractical and thus unrealizable ideal. Even in the language of Canadian multiculturalism, I suggest, there's an implicit timer ticking towards the presumed eventual cultural homogenization of Canada. My language of inclusion and diversity, although rooted for me in my religious tradition, is one attempt to move from theological insights to the public realm without imposing a strictly theological exclusivist language, yet being authentic to both my religious stance and my role as an equal with all others participant in the public, secular, if you will, discourse around the nature of Canada. Religious experience is a profoundly transforming power within our human experience, and provides a great resource of values and strength to many in society. Just as we would not want our religious resources expunged from sight, we need to recognize that persons of other faiths, both as citizens and in religious language as children of God, have the right and responsibility to avail themselves of what is good and valuable in their tradition. By better understanding what we mean by Canada's secular character, and by being more deliberative of the manner in which that secularity is expressed, we can in fact build a more equitable and inclusive society without falling into cultural dilemmas of the past or forcing new Canadians to fit into a cultural straitjacket which we have not even imposed upon ourselves. Canada's secularity can flourish with a public role for all religions. I'd like to conclude with a quotation from a French historian, Henri-Jacques Steicher. Whatever you do, whichever battle you fight, whichever course of action you attempt, with what are you going to inform it all? The love of difference or the passion for similarity? The former, especially if it becomes socially contagious through education, cultural action, political action, leads to human life. The latter leads in full-blown or latent form to exploitation, repression, sacrifice, rejection. Yes or no? Can we live together in fundamental mutual recognition, or must we exclude one another? Thank you.
Myroslaw has graciously agreed to take some questions and perhaps a few very brief comments. You will notice that on each side of the room here there are microphones. I would encourage you to go to the microphone, speak clearly into the microphone, and Myroslaw will answer your question or your comment.
So thank you very much. I enjoyed your presentation. Certainly cultural religious dialogue is something I've been participating in for a long time. And my worldview is one of both oneness, associated with the mystical tradition, the right side of my brain, if you like, and also division and diversity is very much a part of that, associated with my left brain. I was just about 2 months ago over at a conference next door at St. Renison College on his job. And I guess I have certain concerns with symbolic communication. There's what the symbol represents. And there's certain symbols that if people use them in public, had them on them, would become very, very upset. I don't think I need to mention which ones we would be upset at. But the hijab is a symbol, and it represents a certain religio-cultural tradition. And I don't think we've explored Islam and the cultures in which it manifests sufficiently. I am concerned with, I guess, the attitude that people within a religious group can have towards another. And in Christianity, we have not been innocent in that regard. And with respect to even other Christians, we haven't been innocent in that regard. I think we need to explore what various Muslims think of Christians. And there are some thoughts that I'm not too happy with. Muslims in this community say, respect my tradition. I cannot engage in meaningful dialogue with them about their traditions. And we know that some Muslims in the media who tried have had their life threatened. So I'm afraid of expression, but what we communicate is very important. What it represents is very important. And these are things we need to explore more.
Thank you. I agree. And I think, my only comment, additional comment, is I think What I'm asking for is simply that we recognize that we don't yet have an open, equal playing field to discuss those things. And that's something that we can work on. And I think we need to work on that. Thank you.
I was struck by your conclusion. It made me think of the Buddhist principle that says certainty leads to unkindness. Would you comment on that?
I agree. As certain as I can be about that. I'm a fan of Bernard Lonergan. I think one of Bernard Lonergan's insights, he's a Canadian philosopher, theologian, Jesuit. One of the things I took from Bernard Lonergan's work is that the best we can do is approach certainty and recognize that we should always be willing to be corrected. It's just part of our human condition.
You present quite a challenge, Doctor, and my question is, how many societies historically do you know of that have been able to coexist peaceably with the kind of diversity that you're describing?
That's an excellent question. I don't have an answer to it, only because I'd suggest that the kind of mobility of peoples that we're seeing in our contemporary world is unprecedented. We've not had this experience historically. I mean, my parents grew up for one of them until he was 14, the other one when she was 13, in a village. In those years, they never conceived of even going to the other end of Ukraine, nor did they ever conceive that their children would be born elsewhere. They did not choose to leave. They were taken, they were moved, and their life evolved in a totally unexpected pattern, not only for them personally, but everybody around them. That's not uncommon in our world today, right? And we have millions of refugees in this world. And I'm just talking to the people who are forced to move. I'm not even talking about the people who choose to move from country to country or from part of a country to another part of a country. So the kind of diversity that we're experiencing in Canada is something very new in our human experience. So I don't think we can point to an example of a country that's had this kind of mixing, if I can use that word. In addition to that, even where there are countries that have had a high degree of racial or ethnic or religious diversity, each country has its own historical context in which those relationships have developed. So there's another factor, that goes into the mix of analysis. So it's really hard to point to any other situation and say, well, there it's worked or there it hasn't worked. It's not been there yet. We haven't been there yet. This is a new experiment. That's part of the difficulty that, to be honest with you, that many countries in Western Europe are going through right now. They historically seen themselves as monocultural. You were in France, you were French. And that meant that you were French from generation to generation. And today, because of what happened in Algeria, there's now a number of generations of persons who regard themselves as French who are Muslim, but have been segregated and marginalized in that society. And they're only catching up with that reality of diversity now because it was never part of their, so to speak, their social cultural environment, because they had this homogenized culture fundamentally. We haven't ever had a homogenized culture in Canada. Or homogenous, I should say, homogenous culture.
There has been a lot of immigration in Europe, and there's reaction now that immigration, there has been conflict and borders are closing. And I'd like to think that Canada has a more tolerant attitude, but as a sociologist, I also know that it's very difficult for people with various backgrounds to get along together. Unless they have something very strong in common.
It's a given. It is. But it's a project that we're involved in whether we like it or not, right?
Yeah. The only other thing I wanted to say was I wondered how you would explain in Canada that we've had so many French-Canadian prime ministers. We elected them, and it started. It started with Sir John A. Macdonald. He was right up against Sir Wilfrid Laurier, and it has continued right through our history. And our population has elected those French-Canadian politicians to the highest position in the land. They were not WASPs.
And political life is very much a function of a whole bunch of negotiations that happen that are clear and unclear. And Canada's political life is very much a negotiation between, historically, English Canada and French Canada. And that's part of how our political parties are structured, that's part of the evolution of those political parties, and it's part of how they've chosen their leaders. Absolutely. I'm not saying it would. And that's I think part of what I'm getting at is that we say one thing about what this secularism means, and yet there's another reality going on in the lived experience. And I'm suggesting that we need not be afraid to start asking the question of what is the kind of secular society that we as Canadians want, and what is the role of religion, and not just a religion that has been privileged historically, but religion, if we're respectful of that as part of human reality, and if we're respectful of what religion brings to our personal and cultural identity, how do we allow that into the public forum? Rather than going through this what at times I think is duplicity, where we say on the one hand, we're secular and religion doesn't have a place in the public forum, and yet it is there, but unspoken and carefully masked. And now that we're faced with new others, we deal with it in a way in which I don't think necessarily evolves from what I think are my religious fundamental insights.
Very much for your talk. My first comment actually follows very much on previous comments that when you're talking about the late 19th and early 20th century, you're talking about English-speaking Canada having this predominant.
That's why I focus on the prairies. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. But then I would make another distinction within English-speaking religious Canada, and that's the distinction between church and chapel. And that you're talking about the Presbyterian Methodist Reformed tradition, which has already fought a battle with Anglicanism to not have a state-founded church, and that's continuing as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Through what's happening in England with thousands of their Anglican churches now being converted to Muslim mosques. And then you think, could that happen to other countries, that their whole culture be wiped out?
Well, I don't think, again, what starts happening when the fear that you mentioned earlier takes hold is we start magnifying the response to the other, and we also tend to magnify what the other really is doing. So, for example, you made a statement about the Anglican churches, thousands being sold. Well, that means the Anglican church is deciding to sell them. Now, my point here is that this is a cultural negotiations going on, right? Well, all I'm saying is that this is a cultural negotiation that's going on. Cultures shift and change. Part of our fear comes from the presumption, I suggest, that we think that cultures don't change. But they do. They are always changing. And just to speak again from historical experience, from any immigrant group, when we look at what happens to immigrant groups when they come to a new country, is they go through waves and shifts. One of those waves is the desire to assimilate. One of the waves is the desire to separate, to identify oneself more strongly. I haven't seen any statistics. I don't know if anybody's doing any statistical analysis of this, but I would not be surprised if somebody were to analyze how many Muslim girls or women are wearing hijab who, if you could, so to speak, ask them why, that would be part of it is because they feel like they've been separated. So now they're going to reclaim their identity by putting that hijab on. It's in a sense a way of declaring to you, you've made me different, so now I'm going to be different. Right? And it's a cultural negotiation. So all I'm saying is we shouldn't be surprised by that. Now, how do we address the fear? Addressing the fear is only something I can do. I can only address my own fear. I have to I hope, find reasons and values that help me address those fears. Now, I'm speaking admittedly from a religious perspective. I believe I'm a religious person. And so I want to seek values and sources of strength and sources of response from my religious tradition. But I also want to say, and that's part of what I was saying, is that I want to be able to be, for us to be free to recognize that our religious tradition, whatever that is, should have a part in the dialogue of how we negotiate our culture publicly. And that's something which, again, we've restrained ourselves in, or it has been restrained, for various, perhaps historical and good reasons. But again, what I'm suggesting is, as our demographic in Canada has shifted historically, our attitudes and our policies and our approaches have shifted. And perhaps this is a time when we need to shift again. Reflect a bit more consciously on what kind of society we want. And again, if the concern is, well, let's just shut the doors and not accept any immigrants in, personally, I don't think either from a religious standpoint that's acceptable. I don't even think it's possible. It's just not possible in the world we live in today. We do live in a global village. And we have to learn and find strength in ways in which we can live in that village comfortably together.
This is just fascinating, and I almost didn't come tonight because I was too tired, but I made it.
And you stayed awake. Thank
and
you,
I did. You're welcome. I never did fall asleep in any of your classes. I want to give some good news to this dialogue. Here in Kitchener-Waterloo, for the last 7 years, we have been blessed to have a group that's called Interfaith Grand River. I don't know how many of you have heard of it, and I don't know if you know the founding story of it. It was an outgrowth of the KW Council of Churches, which is about 45 years old now, and in the beginning did not permit Roman Catholics to be part of it. But that soon changed, and if those of you who know Father Hauser, he was the first Catholic president of KW Council of Churches. And over the years, KW Council of Churches has engaged in a number of ecumenical endeavors, the last big one of which was an ongoing beginning dialogues between Christians and people of other faith traditions. And over the course of a couple of years, we had Christian-Muslim dialogue and a Christian-Jewish dialogue and a Christian-Sikh dialogue, etc. But the other prong of our approach was to try to gather people of different world religions to sit around a table together to talk of things that people of faith had in common. Over the summer of 2001, we called everybody we knew and set the date for the second Thursday of September. If you count on your fingers quickly, you'll find that was 2 days after 9/11. That found us, 20 of us, sitting around a table, staring at each other because we'd never met before. And we had a big agenda because we had to figure out how to talk to each other in the wake of 9/11. It's a group I know of in KW of this sort of thing that meets every month, winter and summer, including holidays, including December, all of those things. And the whole purpose is to meet our multi-faith neighbor. And what I've heard tonight is about the realization that the other is our neighbor, whether we like it or not, whether they live on our block or in the next town or on the other side of the road. They are our neighbor. And we who are Christian have a duty bound to care for our neighbor as ourselves. And it's fascinating to listen to people around the table from the other world religions find that own sense out of their tradition, whether it's a written one or whether it's a spoken one. There is good news out there, and there's good things happening, so don't go away despairing tonight.
I certainly hope not. Myth-busting hurts sometimes, but it's absolutely true. And I think that the recognition that we need to come to is that we've been nasty to each other for a long time. We just have. We have, but we don't need to be. And we've learned ways of accommodating. Again, this is part of that cultural negotiation that I'm talking about. We learn about ways of respecting each other. And I just suggest that's what we're in right now, learning new ways of respecting each other and being together as neighbors. Thanks, Andy.
I don't want to steal any of Myroslaw's thunder, but I just one real quick story. I just came back from a family visit in the United States, and as you know, so much of what Myroslaw was talking about tonight is politicized in the United States in a very radical way. And just think about what it would mean to build a wall. I mean, we're building a wall in the United States. That's how low the discourse is dived. I mean, so I think what you're talking about, Myroslav, is extremely important, and the hopefulness that came out of some of the comments, I think, is a very good direction, just from my own experience coming here from the United States. I've asked Dr. David Perrin to come and give the official thanks to his colleague, Dr. Tataryn. So please welcome Dr. David Perrin.
Thank you very much, Scott, and good evening to all of you this fine night, beginning of 2008. Best wishes to all of you and your loved ones, your families. On behalf of St. Jerome's University, what a pleasure it is to be here with you tonight and be engaged in such a thoughtful and provocative reflection as has been presented to us from my dear colleague, Dr. Tataryn, and what a pleasure it is, I can assure you, to be working with him. So I would like to say a few words to extend my appreciation. I'm assuming our appreciation for the critical analysis that you have brought to our attention tonight. The question that I'm left with, amongst others, but a focal question that I'm left with, is, are we strangers in our own land? The land that God has kept for us. God, keep our land. Are we strangers in that land? We all know that perspective changes radically with tragedy in our lives, whether on a personal level, a societal level, a national level, and in the event of 9/11, a global level. This event surely has opened up a new horizon. It's poked a gaping hole into so many of our presuppositions, our assumptions, and our values. That gaping hole is yet to be addressed, and tonight's discourse takes us a partial way to help understand through that hole we now look, and what lenses are going to assist us in making sense of our lives. Undoubtedly, there is a gaping hole in our worldview, and that is what Dr. Tataryn has brought to our attention this night. Our assumptions, our values, our presuppositions have been pierced. But how do we fill that hole? And answering that question is not exclusively a task for the churches, but for all engaged and committed to a purposeful life. It's a task for the masses of society. Dr. Tataryn has mentioned that we all have constructed myths. They function in positive and, he's brought to our attention, in negative ways. They include and they exclude. They show and they hide. They build identity and they tear it apart down to its grassroots. So the challenge that we have been presented with this night is, how can we continue to live in the midst of such radical exclusion? I believe this is the central question, not the question of the religious-secular split. How can we turn on their heads the biases and the prejudices that we all have built up? What shades of white do we live in with our own worlds? And what brand of utilitarian Christianity have we subscribed to? In the Academy, we have tackled many issues with respect to post-colonialism, but post-colonial racism, evidently, as Dr. Tataryn has brought to our attention, is not one of them. So there is much to do, there is much work to be done in analyzing what it means to be secular and religious in Canada. What Dr. Tataryn has brought to our attention is that sameness ends in radical silence, not the silence of the contemplatives that opens up a new world of meaning and understanding, but a silence that ends and terminates relationship. Entropy, in this case, has done its work. The image that I'm left with tonight, that I will at least be provoked to thinking much more about, is captured by the phrase, I think that we are living in an entropic gush. An entropic gush. Sameness ends in silence. Dr. Tataryn, on behalf of all of us, thank you very much for a very provocative and engaging presentation.
Just a few final housekeeping matters. The Social Justice Committee of the University Catholic Community sells fairly traded organic coffee, chocolate, and tea in the foyer. At the back, there are sign-up sheets for the center mailing list, so you can receive our brochures by mail. There is also a sign-up sheet if you want email reminders, news events in the area, but particularly reminders about the center. Do check out the book display and check Aaron, who graciously asked the question tonight. He is with Wordsworth Books. He has a number of books from Myroslaw, but also books from previous speakers and even a few future speakers. I want to thank Megan Lasseline, the St. Jerome's Technology Department, and as always, Carol and Ivan Person for really making this evening go. Carol and Megan were meeting you, and Ivan tonight, we're meeting you as you came in. Please give them a smile on the way out. Carol's always around for hugs, too, so I get a hug every time I see Carol, so it's always good to see Carol. I would fail in my job if I didn't point out the donation envelopes that were in your chairs. It's the start of a new year. Feel free to start early. Feel free to put money in there. There's a basket in the back. All money that you donate to the center is tax deductible. You will receive a receipt. Make sure that you fill out the envelope. Finally, I would point you to the next lecture in this year's lecture series. Ruben Habito from Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University will be talking to us about a Christian-Buddhist dialogue, talking about Buddhist practices for a wounded world. It will take place on Friday, January 25th at 7:30. So until then, I want to wish you a safe home and a very wonderful new year, and finally, blessings and peace. Thank you.